Natural Areas Program, followed by a very brief Q&A for specific questions for Andy. Again, if you find you'd like to ask a question during the presentation, please send it to me via the chat box at Kimberly Roth, and I'll see that it is addressed. Then we'll see River Corridor Status, Assessment of Floodplain Forests in Maine, presented by Justin Schalwin of the Maine Natural Areas Program. After his presentation, we will also have an opportunity for brief Q&A for Justin. After the presentations, we will then have time to discuss them, where we will have a discussion of the assessment methods, applicability or transferability to other programs, as well as more time for in-depth questions for Andy and Justin. So to introduce myself, I'm Kimberly Roth. I'm your webinar moderator. I'm an environmental analyst with the New England Interstate Water Pollution Control Commission, or NEWIPIC, and I manage our wetlands program. So Andy Cutko is our first presenter. He's an ecologist with the Maine Natural Areas Program, where his responsibilities include ecological inventory and assessment, conservation planning, and training and outreach to foresters and land managers. Andy has worked at Maine Natural Areas Program for more than 15 years, and he has also worked for NatureServe, the Nature Conservancy, the U.S. Forest Service, and an environmental consulting firm. He is the co-author of Natural Landscapes of Maine, A Guide to Natural Communities and Ecosystems, and he holds a Master of Forestry degree from Duke University and a BA in Biology from Williams College. So I will now pass control to you, Andy.
Okay, I think I have it. Yes. Did everyone hear me okay? Hopefully yes. I'm joined here in Maine by Justin Schalwin, so we have a joint presentation. I'm going to go first talking about EIA methods, and then Justin will follow me. As you said, Kim, talking about floodplain forests. Let's see if this works. Okay, there we go. All right, so we're going to be talking about Maine wetlands. When I was together the presentation, I thought I would grab a majestic photo of a large peatland with Mount Katahdin rising in the background, but then I decided, no, let's not sugarcoat it. Let's just get real. Lots of Maine wetlands are wet, and they are infested with all manner of insects. So this is what a Maine wetland looks like. Welcome to Maine, and welcome to a talk about Maine wetlands. It's not quite Borneo, but it is the best temperate equivalent. All right, next slide. Trying to go to the next slide. Okay, there we go. Here's what I'm going to cover today. I'll give you a little bit of background on the EIA. I will talk specifically about our application of EIA for Maine wetlands, how we've adapted the national protocols and the national methods. What I was putting together the presentation, I started pulling together lots of slides that have been assembled by others on EIA with text and bar charts and graphs. And I soon recognized that when I'm participating in webinars, I last about 8 or 10 slides of those, and so I decided that I'd have some of that information, but really what I want to focus on today is real-life examples of how we're applying EIA to Maine sites. So the bulk of my talk is going to be going through those real-life examples, and then I'll just wrap up with some take-home messages. I do want to acknowledge that this is a true collaborative project. Funding comes from the U.S. EPA, so if EPA folks are on the phone, thank you very much. And we also received some funds from the Maine Outdoor Heritage Fund, and we are largely taking our lead from the EIA methods that have been pioneered by NatureServe. Don Faber-Langendoen is what I consider to be the godfather of EIA, and he's actually in this photo on the left looking very godfatherly-like in his trench coat. And hat. So, Don, if you are on the phone, thank you very much for your guidance. And Bill Nichols from New Hampshire Heritage has also been very helpful. We have adapted a lot of what we've taken from Maine, from New Hampshire, and Bill, again, has been instrumental in that. So it's been a true collaborative project with NatureServe, and many network programs. In the Northeast, New Hampshire has been a lead in using EIA. New Jersey as well has been using EIA, and I believe the New York State Heritage Program has experimented with it to some extent as well. And there are a number of other examples across the country in the NatureServe network. Okay, so moving on, at its core, ecological integrity, or an assessment of ecological integrity, involves a set of indicators of ecosystem structure, function, and composition that are tied into a range of natural variation or historic variation, and then clearly what's outside of that range of natural variation. And as any of you know who have worked with this concept, it's a lot easier to say that than to really put it into practice, but EIA attempts to do that. So for those who are familiar with the Heritage Network and the Heritage rankings, our A and B ranked occurrences are typically within what we consider to be the natural range of variation, and C and D occurrences are outside of that range. But it's those C and D ranked occurrences that we sometimes look at as possibilities for mitigation or restoration, and so there is a real attempt to tie in EIA methods with management needs for those cases where restoration or mitigation are occurring. At its core, EIA really has three pillars, and those are the pillars of landscape context, size, and condition. Each of those pillars has metrics beneath it, and I'll be talking a little bit more about some of the specific metrics that fall within landscape context, size, and condition. And again, those things are historically what heritage programs have used to evaluate natural communities. So moving on to the next slide, this is just a comparison of how natural heritage programs have previously looked at various rank factors and criteria and what's new about EIA. The three pillars are still there: size, condition, and landscape context. The thing that's new about EIA is that size may be looked at independent of condition and landscape context in some cases. As we all know, intact natural wetlands can occur in a wide range of sizes. Take Maine, for example, where we can have large peatlands covering hundreds to thousands of acres in northern Maine. Those same peatland types may be 10 or 20 acres in southern Maine, and may still have a good landscape context and good condition. So in essence, we don't really want to penalize small occurrences just simply because of size. We want to recognize that small occurrences can in fact have high ecological value in terms of condition and landscape context. Size clearly does come into play for many conservation organizations and state agencies when we're evaluating overall conservation value. So we are often still considering size as part of our overall assessment of ecological integrity. But some of the latest thinking on EIA suggests that it can be pulled aside and looked at independently. In terms of the other criteria and rankings and metrics, as the table indicates here, really what's new about EIA is that with EIA we've established a distinct set of metrics that has very explicit attributes and thresholds, and so it's really an attempt to make EIA or make a wetland assessment a lot more repeatable and consistent and remove some of the subjectivity from it. In terms of our former or older natural heritage methods, there tended to be some differences among evaluators because so much of it was based on best professional judgment, and EIA really attempts to remove some of that sort of best professional judgment and distill it into a set of very distinct metrics and criteria and attributes that are repeatable, not only from one person to another, but from state to state and across wetland types. The other thing that I'll mention last here is that there is a recognition of EIA methods that can be applied to three different scales or levels of intensity. A remote-based method that's fairly coarse and can be used with GIS and aerial imagery and other GIS metrics. The rapid-based approach to L2 is what New Hampshire has really done most of its work on and what I'll be focusing on in the talk today. And there can be a more intensive field-based level of EIA, which involves things like water quality sampling, soil chemistry sampling, some of the types of things that were looked at in the National Wetlands Condition Assessment for those of you who are involved in that process. So just a word about EIA and how it may relate to other wetland assessment systems that are out there. Traditionally, heritage programs, natural heritage programs, have focused on conservation values, that's the things like conservation status or rarity and irreplaceability, those items on the left side of the image here. There are other methods, such as the highway method or the New Hampshire method, that are much more focused on ecosystem services or functions and values. And IEI is an attempt to really integrate some of the natural heritage values that are identified on the left side of this image with some of the more functions and ecosystem services that are identified on the right. So that's just a little bit of background on EIA. Again, I see that Don Faber-Langendun and Bill Nichols, Don's from NatureServe and Bill's from New Hampshire, are both on the webinar. So specific questions, they may be able to jump in as well at the end of the discussion. And again, thanks to both of you guys for contributing some of the information here. So I'll talk a little bit about how we are adapting EIA from the national protocols and methods to its application in Maine before I move on to some real-life examples. The goals of applying EIA to Maine involve looking at the manuals that have been developed by Don at NatureServe and Bill in New Hampshire and others, field testing them here. And we've been looking at two specific forested wetland types, floodplain forests and red maple swamps, then taking those national protocols and trying to modify and adapt them for use in Maine. As you all know, wetlands in the prairie pothole region in North Dakota may be different than those in Iowa, which may be different than those in South Carolina. So we want to make sure that whatever we're developing for Maine is going to be useful for conservation practitioners and others who are actually working on the ground in Maine. And so there are some challenges there that I'll address as we go through the presentation here. And then lastly, we want to make sure that once we're done, we're sharing this as we're doing now with other folks who are working on wetland and conservation issues in the region. Where are we with our project? We received EPA funding to begin work on this 3 years ago. We've been in ongoing dialogue with NatureServe in New Hampshire and other states for the last few years. We've now worked on over 70 wetlands in the last 3 years and applied EIA methodology to them. Most recently, this past year, we worked with DEP staff, Maine DEP staff on 12 red maple swamps and used both the floristic quality assessment, which I'll mention a little bit, and EIA to those red maple swamps. We've also developed an access database to store and process the data. And this upcoming year, our sort of final wrap-up things on EIA are to finalize our manual, to review the NatureServe national manual, and then lastly, just to do more outreach. I am giving a presentation at the Maine Association of Wetland Scientists in a couple months. So we hope to be wrapped up with our EIA work by the end of this year. Okay, I did mention a database. As anyone on the phone knows who has worked with EIA, there is a tremendous amount of data that is collected. And so Justin in our office has done a great job with developing an access database where we can collect and store not only the final scores on all of the sites that we visit, but collectively look at each of the metrics and the attributes for the metrics and store that information in a way that we can retain that and use it for long-term monitoring. And built into the database are the quantitative ways that the scores are all rolled up into a final score. So it takes away the computational need to do all that by hand and really does that in a very useful automated way. There is also a National Nature Serve product called EcoObs that performs some similar functions. Okay, so let's get to talking about some real-life examples of wetlands, and I'll walk you through how we have applied EIA to a couple sites in Maine. This first one is called Messalonskee Stream. It is in central Maine. Not much of Maine can be called urban, but certainly downtown Waterville, Maine is one of the places that can be called urban. This is a hardwood river terrace forest along Messalonskee Stream. So this is a type that in its natural occurrence is usually dominated by sugar maple. In central Maine, there can be some bur oak, possibly some silver maple mixed in, or green ash. So it is a relatively uncommon type within Maine. This is a smallish example. It's about 11 acres in size, and so the size rank for it comes out to C. And I'll talk about how we get that in just a second. And size is divided up into two components. There's the absolute size, which is simply what is the acreage of the wetland, and relative size, or how much loss has occurred, how much historic loss has occurred to that wetland. Has there been any fill or significant reduction in size of that wetland? So for size ranks, for our natural communities, we have followed NatureServe guidelines for different patch sizes of natural communities. Different wetlands occur naturally as either small patch or large patch types. Some river shore types may occur as linear types. And so there are NatureServe guidelines for sizes of those. You can see A, B, C, D, where those fall out and where those thresholds are. We have individual size thresholds for each of our natural community types, and so at 11 acres, this falls out into the C category. When we look at condition, there are three primary components of condition: vegetation, hydrology, and soils. And then within each of those components, there are a number of specific metrics as well, as you can see listed here. So we look at all of these factors when we're evaluating the condition of a wetland. And as you can see from this image, as I showed before with a database, each of the attributes are spelled out in our Access database, and so it's simply a matter of going to that tab and then pulling up what the various thresholds are and criteria. And I will say here that we have largely adapted, so this is a vegetation structure of floodplain, forests, and swamps, and we've largely adapted what New Hampshire has done here. So again, Bill, if you're online, thank you very much. We've largely taken what you've done and adapted that directly for use in Maine. Okay, so for this wetland, how did we evaluate condition, or what kinds of things did we consider? Hydrology, there is a obvious hydrological impact or impediment immediately upstream here. There's about a 15-foot high dam that's probably been there for 100 years and clearly influences the water flow and seasonality of flow in this system. So there are hydrologic impacts. When we look at the vegetation, while the tree canopy is fairly characteristic of hardwood river terrace forests, there are a lot of invasive plants. I think there were 11 invasive plants here, although there is some regeneration of bur oak. There's a lot of Japanese knotweed, a lot of honeysuckle. A number of other invasives are fairly prevalent. What you see here is the 1.29 is our weighted coefficient of conservatism, or that's basically a floristic quality assessment score. That 1.29 was one of the lowest scores we got in any floodplain forest, so it's pretty indicative of a forest that has a lot of invasive species. And then soil, it turned out that there was a homeless encampment at this site, and so there was clearly some surface soil alteration, which would influence our rank. I should mention also that in evaluating condition, NatureServe has made available a stressor checklist, and this can be used in a couple different ways. It can be simply used just kind of as a checklist to see what issues are there from a standpoint of stresses on the system. It can also be used in a more quantitative fashion in looking at the severity and scope of the stresses and actually ranking them out. We tend not to do that for most of our sites, although I guess I would say that in cases where there are mitigation or restoration opportunities and you want to really specifically identify the stresses on the wetland, a more formal approach to the stressor checklist in which you're filling out the complete checklist with scores, I think can be a useful task. So, not surprisingly, given the impediments and stresses to this wetland, it ranked pretty low. That this is not the kind of report card that I would want my son or daughter coming home from school with. It's largely C's and D's. The only place it got a B in was hydrologic connectivity. The floodplain forest was in large part directly connected to the water itself. There wasn't a lot of riprap or other things interrupting direct connectivity, so it got a B there. But as you can see, C's and D's for most everything else. And its overall score was 2.6, which gives it a D for condition. Landscape context refers to the condition of the surrounding landscape, and it's approached in a couple different ways, but the way that we've been doing is through a series of concentric buffers around the wetland. You can see this is pretty easily done in GIS with a 50-meter buffer, 250-meter buffer, and 500-meter buffer looking at the land use within those buffer zones. And land uses are assigned a coefficient. This is adapted from Hauer, I think is the original source, from 2002, and NatureServe has adapted this, where every land use gets a score from 0 to 1. Paved roads get 0, natural intact forests with native vegetation get a 1. And you can see that there's a variety of land uses that get intermediate scores in between. So every score within the buffer is assigned to land use, and as you can imagine, you then roll up those scores to get an overall rating. The internal buffer, that is the 50-meter buffer, is given the most weight, and coming up with that calculation at 60%, and you can see the other weights accordingly, and then you can see how the overall land use index is then assigned a rating of A, B, C, or D. Now, I will note that this is one case where we have modified those thresholds to fit Maine. As most of you can imagine, many of our wetlands in Maine are in pretty good landscape settings. Our landscape context is largely, pretty intact for Maine. And so, as you can see here from the national guidelines, there is a bit of a curve that we're grading Maine wetlands on. So a Maine wetland that is ranked C, the higher end of our C might be the lower end of a NatureServe B. And again, we've done that so we could distinguish more clearly wetlands within Maine. And I'll talk a little bit more towards the end about some of the challenges associated with, again, the national versus sort of statewide scale of issues. Okay, so how do we actually do this? There are a couple ways to do it. One is that we have developed, again, Justin was the lead on this, a land use land cover layer from a couple different available layers within Maine. We used a ecological systems layer available from the North Atlantic Landscape Conservation Collaborative, and then infused that with an impermeable surfaces layer from the state and another national layer that's available in Global Forest Change, which is helpful for our forested landscape. So we have an automated way to run this buffer looking at a raster-based land cover. And you can see here that we get a score of 0.51 when we do that. Now, we also have the opportunity to do what we call a manual override. And so in this case, there were a lot of lawns within a largely developed disturbed landscape. There were, yards and lawns and some other small bits of natural habitat. So we were curious if we literally digitized out all the houses and driveways and paved roads, how the landscape context score would result. And clearly, doing this is a task that's a great reason to have interns. We had an intern assigned to this, and he came up with this very detailed map. The landscape context score, not surprisingly, was a bit higher when it was digitized manually. However, in our thresholds, the landscape context still comes out as a D, given that score. So there is a different numeric score, but the letter grade was still a D. So how do we roll all this up? We have pre-field, that should say pre there, I'm not quite sure why that happened, but pre-field you can use the landscape context score to generate a landscape context. And then in the field what we're doing is collecting plot data for things like the floristic quality assessment, doing an assessment of on-the-ground soils, stressors, et cetera. But a lot of what happens with EIA really happens after field work and is done remotely. And as you can see here, the condition metrics, the size metrics, the landscape context metrics all roll up. Each of those get assigned their own ranking, and then those rankings are all weighted to varying degrees, and the overall wetland rank, in this case for Messalonskee Stream, was a 2.13, which is a D. So not a good grade for the Messalonskee Stream wetland, not surprisingly. In terms of what we've done with our database in Maine, we've come up with a way to summarize the data in one summary sheet. So this is a sheet that we can print out, sort of summarizing the scores and the comments for each of the criteria that we looked at. And as you can see there, those are our thresholds for A, B, C, and D on a 5-point scale. Okay, so that was one wetland, and I'll spend less time talking about this one since you, I think, have the gist of how we assess wetlands, but just to give you a contrast in another type of wetland and another set of conditions and settings for a much larger wetland in northern Maine. This is a silver maple floodplain forest along the west branch of the Pleasant River, not far south of Baxter State Park and Mount Katahdin, and I don't know, probably 4 or 5 miles away from the Appalachian Trail near the 100-mile wilderness. So a much more remote setting. This is one of the largest examples of this type in the state at over 500 acres. So clearly it gets an A for size. And as you can see here, our silver maple floodplain forest, this is a slightly different floodplain forest type, and so it has different acreage thresholds. Those are shown here, and so clearly it's well above 250 acres, and so it does get an A for size. And in looking at the condition, we're obviously looking at the same characteristics. How did it come out? Quite well, actually. It's floristic quality index, the weighted mean coefficient of conservatism was 4.35, which turned out to be one of the best FQI scores that we got for all of our floodplain forests. So intact in terms of vegetation composition, intact in terms of structure, old, large trees, coarse woody debris, regeneration. It really looked like an outstanding example, and the metrics seem to prove that as well. And no invasive species in terms of plants. There was one invasive species, which I'll get to in a second here. So if my son came home from high school and gave me this card, I would be very happy. So this site scored very well, basically A's for everything except disturbance. And the reason, interestingly, it got a B for disturbance is there were earthworms in the soil at a couple different spots. I think Justin may talk a little bit more about surprising findings of earthworms in floodplain forests, but for those who aren't aware, earthworms, all of earthworms in our range are non-native, and we have been surprised in the last few years at seeing how pervasive earthworms are. So it got a B for soil disturbance, but otherwise all A's. Landscape context is very good, but not quite an A. It got a B. There is actually a dirt road. You can see the dark lines here are dirt logging roads, and there is a dirt logging road that is immediately adjacent to the wetland for a few miles. And so as you can see from the table at the bottom, the 50-meter score, EIA 50, was actually the lowest of the buffers, and that's because that road had an impact within that immediate closest buffer zone. But nonetheless, it was pretty good. It got a 0.992 or 926 technically for landscape context, so a B. And when we roll this, all these scores up for this wetland, it's clearly in the A range. So 4.73, one of the best scores of any wetland we have looked at. So we have, and as you can see here again, this is the printout on that site, and each of the metrics are indicated on the final roll-up sheet. Okay, just a couple slides to finish up here and some general EIA considerations. Clearly, one of the challenges is adherence to the national methods and standards while adapting them to Maine situations. And we're kind of toying with this idea of having a Maine rank for wetlands and then also having an equivalent national rank, or basically ranking Maine wetlands according to Maine-based standards, so that it shows sort of the condition of the wetland relative to other Maine wetlands, and then having another ranking that's based on the national standards that could be compared across state lines. When we have tested this in the past, the rankings for the national rankings generally come out about 1 grade better than the Maine rankings. In other words, a wetland that might be considered B in Maine will often be considered A at the national level. And that's simply because we have a lot of very large and very intact wetlands in very good condition. Anyway, that's one of the kind of concepts that we're working on. The second point here is that I think a regional or eco-regional reference data set would be very useful, so we could really calibrate these A to D rank thresholds so that for a certain type of salt marsh, for instance, we know how salt marshes score in New Hampshire and Massachusetts, and so we can calibrate them to how they might score in Maine. So a reference data set across the region. Another factor that I didn't really talk much about is that the scale of classification obviously does have an influence on how you rank things and what the metrics mean. We've largely been using our state natural community types. There are other systems out there that at a national level, ecological systems are fairly coarse. National vegetation classification systems are fairly fine or smaller scale, and so you obviously just need to know what classification system you're using so that apples are compared to apples and oranges compared to oranges. And there could be a lengthy discussion about that, but I did just want to note that that's an important consideration. Just my, I think, last conclusive or text slide here. Just some take-home messages that EIA does provide a more consistent and repeatable method for evaluating wetland condition and conservation value. It's clearly, I think, more objective than former natural heritage methods, and so I'm very pleased that, again, Don and NatureServe and Bill in New Hampshire and others are beginning to buy into this method, and we will as well. And again, given the work that Don and Bill have done, I think there is a real foundation for using EIA for other states. It's obviously going to be a lot less work for anyone else who wants to do this than it was for Bill. We've bootstrapped off of what Don and Bill have done, and I think it will, the more states obviously that are using this, the easier it will become for others to adapt it. And then the last point is just a reiteration of a point that I just made about the need and utility of a set of reference set of EIA scores. And I haven't followed enough the products of National Wetlands Condition Assessment to know whether those wetlands might be scored with EIA and used as a reference set. Others on the phone may know about that, but clearly a reference set is needed. And I think that is my point, and here is my majestic slide of a large wetland. I'd like to say that's Mount Katahdin, but that's not. That's actually Big Spencer Mountain, which is just from the shadow of Mount Katahdin. So, thank you very much. I went probably a little over, but Kim, I will defer to you as to how much time you want to spend here for questions.
I think if there are any immediate questions for Andy, if you want to go ahead and type them to me at Kimberly Ross, we'll take them now. If you want to advance a slide, I can do an intro for Justin while we're seeing if there are any questions. All right. Justin has worked as an ecologist with the Maine Natural Areas Program as well for 3 years, focusing on ecological inventory and monitoring, natural community classification, public lands management, and GIS analysis. Additionally, Justin helps to manage Maine's conserved lands spatial database. Prior to working with Maine Natural Areas Programs, Justin worked with the Kennebec Land Trust and the Nature Conservancy of Maine. Justin graduated from Bates College with a BA in Environmental Studies. Oh, we have one question before we move on. What are some applied applications, regulatory or conservation, for the EIA approach from states in the Northeast? To Andy.
Yeah, I would invite Don or Bill to jump in on this as well. Clearly, we're using EIA in a couple of different contexts. I think it will inform it will totally revise our assessment of conservation value of wetlands. So in working with groups like land trusts, the Nature Conservancy, and others on the ground who use our data, I think this information will be a lot more useful for them, not only in terms of looking at sites to preserve, but for others who are looking at mitigation or restoration. We have what's called a in lieu fee program here in Maine. We're starting to look at uses of EIA assessments for application of wetlands that need to be restored through state mitigation funds. So those are just a couple examples here in Maine. Bill or Don, I don't know if you guys have the ability to jump in with examples from your states or your regions.
I can't unmute them because I'm not sure exactly which lines they are without unmuting everybody. So
okay.
Let's keep that on the top of the agenda to discuss when we hit the discussion portion.
Yeah, I guess the one thing I would say is that we have not, we in Maine are not in the Natural Areas Program, not a regulatory agency, and so that hasn't been our, aim in developing EIA. However, we are working with Maine DEP, which is the regulatory agency, and they're just sort of getting up to speed on EIA, and that might be a discussion or question for them at some point.
We'll make sure to come back to that. But for now, Justin, you're on.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. I want to thank Andy for a great opening act. Not only did we maintain all the attendees that we had when he started, but we actually gained a few more. It's a very dense topic, so thanks, Andy. Okay, I'm going to be talking about a project we've been working on for several years now, titled The Status of River Corridors and Assessment of Floodplain Forests in Maine Watersheds. We've been working so far on the 2 watersheds that are completely encapsulated in Maine boundaries, including the Penobscot and Kennebec River watershed, identifying some of the rare floodplain forest types that occur in those watersheds, updating a lot of our mapping of those features. So I went with the majestic picture on the beginning of this slide because, I don't know, I had to. Okay, so topics to be covered. I'm going to begin by talking about some of the context and reason that we're interested in inventorying floodplain wetlands in Maine, and talking a bit about the Maine's large river floodplain wetlands in their regional context throughout the Northeast. I'm going to talk a bit about the different rare floodplain forest types that we track at the Maine Natural Areas Program here in Maine, and that were the target for inventory in this work. I'm going to talk about our remote sensing landscape analysis approach to identifying sites that might contain some of these rare floodplain forest types. Next, I'm going to talk about our landowner contact approach to identifying landowners and contacting them. It's our departmental policy that we obtain written permission from all landowners for whom we want to visit their lands. Next, I'm going to talk about some of the field survey results from this work. I'm going to not touch too much on the methods of our field inventory. Andy really, I think, drove that home in the last presentation. We've been using the EIA methods for all of our floodplain forest wetland surveys. Lastly, I'm going to touch on conservation outcomes for this work and some of the next steps that we'll be taking. And I just as Andy mentioned, our EIA work was also funded through an EPA grant, and this work has also been funded through the EPA as well as the Maine Outdoor Heritage Fund. So again, thank you very much. Okay, so I'm going to just touch on a number of points for why floodplain wetlands are an important conservation priority in Maine. These in sort of no specific order. Large river floodplain wetlands are really important habitats for Maine species of greatest conservation need. 35 species of greatest conservation need in Maine's new State Wildlife Action Plan are associated with hardwood floodplain forests. Vernal pools are a really important part of floodplains. A lot of the vernal pools that occur in floodplain wetlands are very diverse and contain a full range of invertebrate and vertebrate diversity. Floodplain wetlands are really important for flood control and prevention. They're really important sources for drinking water. There's a lot of convergence in Maine between sand and gravel aquifers and floodplain wetlands. They're a really important part of the aquatic and riparian connectivity piece. There's been a lot of recent work in Maine looking at and identifying barriers to riparian connectivity, and this is also really important for floodplain wetlands because the hydro period and hydrologic connectivity are really important to maintain the erosion and accretion balance that really allows some of the rare floodplain forest types, but also other wetland types to occur in these places. And so there's a real, additionally, there's real convergence of ecological and recreational values along riparian corridors and in floodplain wetlands. However, a lot of our current floodplain wetlands, specifically hardwood floodplain forests, are generally reduced from their historic extent. Back when a lot of our river corridors were the first superhighways of New England, a lot of these areas were heavily cut and became log landings. Later, because the soils in a lot of these areas are really prime agricultural soils, many sites have been converted to agriculture, and while a few have been reverted back to forest, most of the ones that were converted to agriculture, at least in Maine, are still in some form of agriculture. And the remnant sites, the few that remain, are now at risk of being invaded by invasive plants. River corridors are areas of connectivity that, unfortunately, provide opportunities for invasive plants to colonize. So Maine has a really high regional responsibility for its large river floodplain wetlands. This map shows the relative acreage of large river floodplain wetlands within the Nature Conservancy's terrestrial habitat data set, broken out by different watersheds. And you can see that there's actually quite a bit of acreage of large river floodplain wetlands, which include some of those rare floodplain forest types that I'm going to talk about in a bit, but also more common floodplain types, large meadows, alder swamps, and other sorts of things. But in addition to having a lot of these wetlands, the condition of our large river floodplain wetlands is very high in Maine. In this map, what we're looking at is the median local connectivity of these large river floodplain wetlands within the Nature Conservancy's terrestrial habitat data set. And the median local connectivity value is drawn from the Nature Conservancy's resilience, climate resilience analysis, and it's a metric that basically describes the ecological condition of different sites. So as you can see from this map, Maine's watershed, the large river floodplains in Maine's eastern watersheds specifically are really high condition. Okay, so next I'm going to talk about some of the rare floodplain forest types that occur in Maine that were the target of this survey work. These include silver maple floodplain forest, hardwood river terrace floodplain forest, and balsam poplar floodplain forest. Silver maple floodplain forest, as the name implies, is dominated by silver maple in the overstory and also can include bur oak and basswood. Bur oak is a species with sort of a disjunct range while it is not very common in other New England states, it's actually quite common in central Maine wetlands. The understory may include sensitive fern, ostrich fern, Canada blue joint, and wood nettle, and is often really dense and provides there's high percent cover of vegetation in the understory. This is a large patch community type, and so it occurs generally in acreages of about 100 acres, more or less, in Maine. This map shows the distribution of silver maple, and silver maple extends. Maine is basically the northeasternmost extent which silver maple occurs in any great abundance. So compared to that map of the large river floodplain condition, it kind of indicates that that Maine contains some of the really the highest quality large river temperate floodplain forests in the Northeast. Okay, so another rare floodplain forest type that we track in the state of Maine is hardwood river terrace forest. And it includes sugar maple, basswood, red maple, and red oak in the overstory. With the understory is a bit richer than silver maple floodplain forest and includes ostrich fern, maidenhair fern, blue cohosh, and a number of rare plant species, including wild leek, wild garlic, and Goldie's fern. Balsam poplar floodplain forest is a rare floodplain forest type that occurs mostly in the St. John River watershed in the northern part of Maine. The canopy is dominated by balsam poplar and includes American elm, black cherry, and some other species. The understory contains many of the other species that we saw in those other floodplain types: ostrich fern, Canada blue joint, wood nettle, speckled alder. And this is a type that's slightly more arboreal in distribution. So in 2012, prior to beginning our survey work, we had a limited number of occurrences of any of these floodplain forest types mapped in the state of Maine. And many of these occurrences were old. They were over 20 years old, which means that they were about to become historic occurrences. And a lot of the classification and the geometry to which these had been mapped was sort of poor. And then additionally, there were many known sites out there that we had never visited. So next point I'm going to touch on is our landscape analysis approach to detect these wetlands through remote sensing techniques. We examined a number of different land cover layers to help us identify sites throughout these watersheds, including the Nature Conservancy's terrestrial habitat map and the land fire land cover layer and some others. But we found that they didn't quite do what we wanted. There was either too much error of commission or too much error of omission. So we decided to put together a very simple tool that identified flat places near rivers that had hardwood forest. And so the data inputs we used was a 10-meter digital elevation model, a national land cover data set, and just identified those sites that were within 75 meters of these large rivers and streams. This tool has a fairly high error of commission, but a low error of omission, and paired with the highest quality aerial imagery, leaf-off aerial imagery, we were able to identify many different floodplain sites that may contain a lot of our rare floodplain wetlands. So using this approach in the Penobscot and Kennebec watershed, we identified 140 different sites. 62 of those sites were identified in the Penobscot watershed, and these were larger and unfragmented, while there were more sites identified in the Kennebec River watershed, but these were generally smaller and more fragmented, and some of them might actually have been the sort of at one time part of the same site, but now have been fragmented by agriculture or development. So our landowner contact approach, as I mentioned, it's our departmental policy to contact all landowners for permission to visit their lands. we were granted permission to visit lands owned by 8 different industrial timber companies in the Penobscot watershed, 4 private nonprofit foundations, the Penobscot Indian Nation, and 79 of 234 small private landowners. Now, I don't mean to be mean to those landowners. Landowners come in all shapes and sizes, but these we call the small private landowners, those that own smaller lots, maybe 200 acres or less. We received landowner permission to visit 48 of the 62 sites identified, and these included really some of our highest priority sites for inventory, ones we felt were most likely to have some of these rare floodplain forest types in them, and some of the floodplain forests with some of the highest condition. Also, plenty of sites, the whole range of condition. In the Kennebec River watershed, we were granted permission from 4 different industrial timber companies, 2 private nonprofit foundations, a hydroelectric company that maintains a lot of the dams along the Kennebec River, and 126 of 313 small private landowners that also come in all shapes and sizes. And we received landowner permission for 50 of the 78 sites that we identified. And again, these were really the highest priority sites for inventory. So I'm going to glaze over the methods. Andy mentioned that in a lot of detail with the Ecological Integrity Assessment presentation. We used those methods to assess our floodplain wetlands in both of these watersheds. In the Penobscot River watershed, we visited 48 different sites. We identified 15 new silver maple floodplain occurrences and updated 6 old records. With Hardwood River Terrace floodplain forest, we identified 8 new occurrences and updated 8 records. Balsam Poplar floodplain forest, we identified the first occurrence that was outside the St. John River watershed, and that was in the top of the Penobscot River watershed. I want to bring your attention to this photo on the bottom right-hand corner. That's sort of the typical growth of silver maple, this multi-stemmed tree, very open-grown, because I'm going to talk about that in just a second. So this map shows sort of that these different sites that we visited were really distributed throughout the watershed, and the occurrences that we mapped were distributed throughout the watershed. But the acreage of some of these rare floodplain forests was really aggregated in a few smaller watersheds, including the Pleasant River of the Piscataquis watershed, the East Branch Penobscot, and portions of the Mattawamkeag watershed. So the reason I brought your attention to that multi-stem silver maple is this is another example of a photo of a silver maple on the right. This is a silver maple that occurred within the East Branch Penobscot, and this is a tree that's over 130 feet tall. And what was so exceptional, one of the exceptional things I should say about this site, is that there were many trees that were over 100 feet tall that were apparently somewhat shade-grown trees that didn't grow in that multi-stemmed way. That's pretty unusual in floodplain wetlands, and that to us was sort of indicative that these were really, this was really a sort of a late successional site, which is pretty uncommon and you don't really see in silver maple floodplain forest. Some other aspects that were really exceptional about the East Branch Penobscot site is that it was really one of the largest macro sites in the state, 3,300 acres, and both silver maple floodplain forest and Hardwood River Terrace floodplain forest were identified in this site. There were actually 2 occurrences of Hardwood River Terrace floodplain forest within this larger macro site. I'm not going to go through the EIA steps and how this is my son that would look really good getting his report card home, but needless to say, this kid got a great report card. 4.75 out of 5, a solid A rank for the silver maple floodplain forest. The 2 occurrences of Hardwood River Terrace floodplain forest were ranked differently. One received an A rank and one received a B rank because of some timber harvesting that likely occurred 70 or 80 years ago. Another thing that was interesting about this site is that the Hardwood River Terrace floodplain forest, one of those occurrences, received the highest floristic quality assessment average of any floodplain occurrence in the state so far. Andy already mentioned the West Branch Pleasant River, another one of the largest silver maple floodplain occurrences in the state. So actually, interestingly, there's a large wood turtle population for which Andy, when he was doing survey work at this site, made a number of observations which were incidental to the work we were already doing. The site, as Andy mentioned, received a rank and a high average floristic quality assessment score. Now, neither of these sites had any, not even a single individual of an invasive plant in them, which is, I think, probably pretty exceptional among temperate hardwood floodplain forests. It's certainly exceptional in Maine, and really only occurred in the really only occurs probably in the Maine's northern watersheds, the Penobscot watershed, the St. John watershed. We visited very few sites in the Kennebec River watershed that had no invasive plants or few invasive plants. Additional results, we identified a number of rare plants in the Penobscot watershed, additionally identified a number of exemplary common natural community types, including alder floodplain, blue joint meadow, and some others. And as I mentioned already, we made some rare animal observations. Another additional result, we identified several potential new natural community types that we may track in the future, including a type called the Hydradiant floodplain forest, which occurs sort of at the upper ends of some flashy streams. These sites are dominated by more upland species, but the soils are still alluvial soils. So they're kind of interesting sites, sometimes have a very rich species composition. Another interesting result is that we found invasive earthworms at every single site throughout the Penobscot watershed. We had the fortune of having an earthworm expert as an intern working with us, and he was able to identify many of these earthworms to species. The dominant earthworm that we were finding was in the genus Aporectidea. It's a sort of translucent earthworm that's from Europe, and so it's a little bit discouraging finding those results, since we felt that our floodplain forests were among the sort of the highest condition in the region, that probably there were no floodplain forests that were absent of earthworms. Invasive earthworms have a lot of impacts to certainly rich upland forest and changing species composition. It's not really known how they impact floodplain forests, partly because there's not really any reference sites without earthworms at this point to identify that, but certainly I'm sure some methods could be proposed to find more information about that. So preliminary results in the Kennebec watershed. This project is still undergoing. We visited 27 sites through 2015 with 4 new silver maple floodplain forest occurrences and 2 updates. We had 6 new Hardwood River Terrace forest occurrences with 1 update, and these were, again, pretty dramatic updates, changing in some cases, the classification, and in all cases, dramatically changing the mapped acreage and the geometry at which we were mapping these features. Also, there were, as of yet, we've identified 13 new rare plant occurrences, which is looking like we're going to identify a lot more rare plants in the Kennebec River watershed, and we believe that's largely because the sites are a lot richer. The soil pH has a lot to do with whether or not we find some of the rare plants in Maine. A lot of our rare plants are associated with higher pH soils, and so the Kennebec River floodplains just seem to have richer soils. Unfortunately, the sites in the Kennebec watershed, as I mentioned earlier, they're more fragmented and disturbed, and as a result, there's a lot more invasive species impacts. The photo on the bottom, all the green that you see and sort of low to the ground is invasive goutweed. So some conservation outcomes of this work. All the landowners that we've asked permission to visit these lands were informed, and many are interested in the important habitats that occur in their land. A good example of this has been the Penobscot Indian Nation. When we provided them the results of our work on their land. They own quite a few of the islands within the Penobscot River, and they are in the process of updating their wetlands plan, and it's likely that these features are going to be included as special protection areas. Our data is integrated into a state database, which is used for environmental review and forest management and development plans. Also, our information has supported land conservation proposals. It's integrated in the state's in-lieu fee mitigation database. So these wetlands could be a prime target for conservation if there's an impact to a cluster forested wetland appropriate. A specific conservation project for which our information has been very useful. We've looked at several slides now of the A-ranked West Branch Penobscot, the kid that came home with the good grades. Well, there's a conservation project in the works. The Forest Society of Maine has been working. What did I say? West Branch. Oh, I said yes. It's the West Branch Pleasant, not West Branch Penobscot. I'm sorry. There's a conservation project in the works now where they're still in the fundraising phase, but it's looking at that's going to be happening in the next few years. All right, so the next steps to this project, we've completed the assessments in the Penobscot River Watershed and are hoping to complete the Kennebec River Watershed in 2016. And then we'll be beginning with the Androscoggin and Saco River watersheds fairly soon and completing that work in 2017. All right. Thank you very much. Questions?
Thanks, Andy and Justin. We're going to go ahead and open the lines so everyone can participate in the discussion portion. If you have a question, feel free to speak up. If you are not speaking, please utilize the mute button on your phone.
Your line has been unmuted.
And this is where we find out who's in a conference room as well. All right, so earlier we were talking about some applied applications, and Andy had suggested that Don or Bill might have better answers. So to put you guys on the spot, if you're still on the line, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
This is Don. Thanks, Andy and Justin, for a great presentation. Good to see the overview. You mentioned a number of applications that are pretty standard, including the mitigation applications and restoration. Just one example from my end. In terms of restoration, we have a project now with the Federal Natural Resource Damage Assessment Program, which is responsible for restoring damaged lands in federally regulated areas. And we're using EIA to characterize the current status of a set of restoration sites, comparing those sites to the EIA scores of local benchmark reference sites. And those benchmark sites come from a variety of sources, including Heritage Program sites. And so we're then proposing to monitor both sets of sites to see how well the restored sites recover to some level of reference condition. So that's one way that we're seeing it used, and there are quite a few examples like that in other kinds of EIA applications, not necessarily just with nature serves. And then there are also quite a few applications relating to identifying the best remaining examples of wetland and upland reference sites or types across the state, much like Justin presented for the silver maple stands, and then to use those to guide conservation efforts. Some states actually have mandates to provide to their state programs where best remaining examples are found. Those are a few.
Hi, Andy. This is Bill. Can you hear me?
We can hear you, Bill. Hopefully everyone else can, too.
Yep.
Yes.
Thanks for both presentations. And Similar to any situation in Maine, EIA improves our Natural Heritage Bureau's understanding of conservation value and assessing whether or not any particular wetland occurrence is exemplary. And that information is passed on to different conservation organizations. And it's also the exemplary occurrences that are also used in our environmental reviews. And in addition, we've worked closely with the Department of Environmental Services, and I think Sandy Crystal participated in this, and DES administered the funds associated with our EIA projects that were awarded by EPA. And we've also worked on one project with DOT. And both agencies are aware of the methods, value, and restoration regulation. And, you know, we're moving forward in that direction in a manner as we can as time goes on.
So I just got a question from Beth Alifat. She asks, in any of the assessments, did you observe the buffer area and observe whether its condition correlated with the EIA of the wetland area?
Do you want to hear the question?
Hi, Beth. This is Andy. Can you rephrase that question?
Yes, I'm losing my voice. I have a really bad cold, which is why I typed it in. But I was curious whether or not you saw any or observed any difference in, say, the wetland buffer, if there were disturbances in the buffer, whether that then you had a lower score in the wetland adjacent to the buffer, or whether it was just the wetland area you looked at.
This is Justin. It kind of depends on where we have landowner permission, whether we, well, it's not really our target to assess buffer completely, but a lot of times when we're doing our assessments of wetlands, we are doing assessments of the buffer permission. We will often do that, and generally, if the buffer appeared to be impacted, the wetland also, in many cases, was impacted, and you know that there's certainly a range of impacts that might happen in the buffers. Some of these wetlands, from you know, a simple dirt road going along the side of the wetland versus the entire surrounding area being converted to farm fields, and obviously that greater degree of disturbance to those areas, we did observe a greater lower integrity of those wetlands. I don't know if, Andy, you want to...
Yeah, I think if I understand the question, Beth, what you're asking is if we independently came up with, for instance, a score for the wetland itself, and then with a score for the buffer, and then independently looked at the association of those two scores to see if there was a correlation between the condition of the wetland itself and the condition of the buffer. We haven't done that exact exercise, but it's kind of an interesting question. Off the top of my head, I would say there would clearly be a correlation. Most of the wetlands we looked at were, particularly in the floodplains, were the better examples of sites. So I'm thinking about the red maple swamps we went to, where most of the degraded examples of sites themselves with a lot of invasive plants, for instance, had compromised buffers. So I think there is a pretty high correlation between degraded buffers and degraded sites. We do have the data where we could actually do that comparison and, you know, come up with a correlation coefficient, for instance. We haven't done that. We did, just as an aside, we have been playing around with coming up with looking at correlation coefficients between the floristic quality assessment and the various metrics that FQA it can be used, weighted coefficient of conservatism, mean coefficient, the different FQI scores in EIA, and there is a positive correlation, but it's not particularly strong. I think it was like 0.5 or 0.6 or something. So we are looking at various ways that the different metrics are correlated with one another is kind of the short answer there, but we haven't done the landscape context in the wetland itself.
That was precisely my question. Thank you.
So I see another question in the chat, and Josh Wilson asks, how would you differentiate the EIA approach from the NWI plus approach?
Yeah, I will say that I don't know a whole lot about the NWI approach, NWI plus approach. I think my sense, and there may be others on the phone that know more about it than I do. I know Kristen in our office, I think, was the one who was talking to me about it the other day. The sense that I get is that WI plus leans more towards the functions and values end of wetlands and does try to integrate some of the IEI characteristics of condition of the wetland itself, but that I think IEI does a better job and is more focused on overall condition of the wetland, whereas NWI plus is really a way to characterize more the type of wetland and the types of functions and values that are associated with it. So that's my impression, but again, my knowledge of NWI plus is somewhat cursory.
Hi, this is Beth again. I have a question for the group. Hello?
Go for it.
Oh, okay. I wasn't sure. Sorry. I was really impressed with the numbers you got for landowner permission, and especially with some of the timber groups. And what was their interest in having you go out and look at their land and assess their land? I just thought the numbers were really impressive. If you could talk about that a little bit. Thanks.
Yeah, this is Andy. I'll touch on that. And a couple things to just say about the landowner. Thank you for saying that the numbers are positive, because it does take a lot of work, and so we're proud of the effort that we make. And those numbers actually were the positive responses, and we didn't want to give the impression that all the others were negative. In fact, most of the other responses are just people we don't hear back from. So it's really, at the end of the day, it's a relative minority of landowners who actually say no. The majority of them are ones we just don't hear back from. So, but it does take a lot of effort. In terms of the large landowners, one of the big drivers for them working with us is called forest certification, and you may be somewhat familiar with that. There are two systems, the Sfi program and the FSC program, which are intended to be market-driven green certification systems where the large landowners can essentially kind of get points for the amount of biological information they have and for conserving rare features. So many of in fact, almost all of the primary large landowners in Maine now are certified to one of those systems, and so it behooves them to work with us so that they can meet the certification system. So the certification system have actually been a real benefit to us in our relationship working with landowners, and we do actually get called by auditors from the certification systems to ask us our impression of the landowners. So it's nice for us to be able to say that at least they've let us do inventory work on their land.
Did we have any other questions for Andy and Justin? Anyone can jump in or feel free to ask. Just go ahead and take your line off mute, and if you have a question, you can go ahead and ask it. All right, well, we have come pretty much to the end of our time. I just wanted to thank Justin and Andy for presenting. We had a really good turnout and lots of great questions and discussions. So Thank you all. If you missed an episode, stay tuned for the Wetlands webinar webpage that we're working on currently that will be hosted on newipic.org. And this concludes our fall series. We will be looking into perhaps a spring or, depending on the way schedules work out, maybe another fall series. But thank you for everybody that has participated throughout this fall series. And I'll be in touch. Look for emails. Thank you.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you, Andy.
Thank you, everybody.